Hey everybody, and thank you so much for joining this first of a number of workshops on CBT for anxiety. And in these workshops, we're going to be generally looking at developing a number of skills to help us manage anxiety for ourselves. And if we're having CBT treatments at the moment, this course, this series of workshops will help us to better understand that CBT that we're accessing at the moment. And it will be extra practice of the skills and techniques that we need for those sessions. My name's Kevin O'Doherty. I'm a psychologist, a forensic mental health expert witness. And most of my work these days focuses on doing psychological assessments for people and writing medical legal reports, which I then send to their solicitors, as we would call them in the UK, or lawyers, as we would call them in the States. And this is for a variety of reasons. So then the lawyers or the attorneys will use those reports to fight legal cases, apply for asylum for the individual, for example. So it's basically any situation where somebody needs a good evaluation of their mental health and well-being. I also am a CBT therapist, and I provide CBT for clients mainly via webcam on an individual basis or groups as well, like today's group workshop. Okay. These sessions are free, and they're intended to be free for anybody who can hopefully make use of the sessions and can gain a number of skills by attending the sessions. And I've intentionally made them free for that reason, so that anybody can access them and they don't have to pay. But if anybody would like to make a contribution, a financial contribution, the details are in the description of today's workshop. And basically my PayPal email address is there, kmodoherty@hotmail.com. And no amount is too large or too small. Okay, I'll leave that with you, and thank you very much either way. Okay, let's start by having a think about what is cognitive behavior therapy. It's a form of therapy that was developed in the 1960s by the psychiatrist Dr. Aaron Beck. And he was a psychoanalyst, and he worked with clients experiencing a range of difficult emotions such as anxiety, depression, and worry, for example. And in terms of the clients that were depressed, what he found was that many of them were continuing to be depressed week after week, despite his best efforts at providing treatments for them. So he began observing more closely those sessions with the clients that he had. And he began noticing that a number of the clients had a certain style of thinking that was quite overly negative and unhelpful. And so he analyzed this, and he came up with the ideas that perhaps he should focus his efforts on helping those people to change the way they think from unhelpful, negative ways of thinking to more helpful, constructive ways of thinking. So he gradually began challenging, in a very nice way, challenging patients during the sessions on some of the negative thinking styles that they had. And he encouraged them to explore, how is this helping you to think about the situation in this way? How is that helping you? Okay. And later on, he would then work with them to begin to find more helpful, constructive alternatives to those unhelpful ways of thinking. He began highlighting a number of thinking errors that we're going to look at in these sessions. Okay. So basically, when he changed his therapeutic intervention to helping people highlight their negative thinking styles and begin to change them for more helpful, constructive ways of thinking, he noticed that, for example, the clients who were depressed, their mood was beginning to lift quite significantly. So he came to the conclusion then that actually the way that we think about situations really does impact on how we feel. And when we're feeling depressed, it's often because we're thinking about things in a depressed kind of way. Okay. More on that later on. In these workshops, for now, we're going to be focusing on anxiety. Okay. So Dr. Ehrenbeck would say that, for example, when people think in anxious, worrying kind of ways, naturally they're going to begin to feel anxiety and they will feel worried and unsettled about stuff. Okay. So that's a bit of the history. Okay. It goes much further back than Dr. Ehrenbeck in the 1960s. And the actual theory behind cognitive behavior therapy is related to Stoicism. And I'll leave you to look that up in your own time, because I don't want to go off on a tangent. But Stoic or Stoicism, Stoic philosophy, really does provide the foundation for cognitive behavior therapy. Okay. Okay. In CBT, we have what we call the cognitive triad. And this is the idea that thoughts, feelings, and behaviors are all interrelated. Okay. If you could imagine, if you draw on a piece of paper, a triangle, okay, and at the top, you would put the top corner, you would write thoughts, and then down here, you would put feelings, and here you would put behaviors. Okay. And central to CBT, cognitive behavior therapy, is this idea that all these three things are related. So how we think affects how we behave. How we think affects how we feel. How we feel affects how we behave. How we behave affects how we think. Okay, so they're all related. And it doesn't really matter whether we say one causes the other. Thoughts cause the feelings, or the behavior causes the thoughts. It's not really so important. Okay, but what is important is that once we know that thoughts, feelings, and behaviors are directly related, they're all interrelated. Okay, they all play a part in the way that we feel. Then we have to come up with a way of intervening, okay, making some kind of a change in that triangle, in that loop, if you like. And in CBT, we often start off with helping people to understand the way that they're thinking and how this might be affecting the way that they're feeling. Okay. Further on down the line, we do begin to help people to understand what behaviors they have and how these might be related to how they feel, and how perhaps we can find more helpful, constructive behaviors that will help to tackle the anxiety or the depression or whatever other emotional issue there is. So that's called the cognitive triad. It would be helpful if you draw a small triangle and just write notes around that triangle and call it the cognitive triad. In the top corner, put thoughts. And in this corner, put feelings. And this corner, write behaviors. And draw two-way arrows between each corner, just to remind you that all these things are related. Okay, that's the first step I would recommend. Okay. By the way, if you have any questions, please do enter them into the chat box. In between these sessions, please do email me, KM, that's K for Kevin, M for Michael, ODOHERTY @hotmail.com. Okay. Any questions at all, comments, you can enter them into the chat box or you can email me. Okay. So thoughts and feelings are interrelated. Okay. They're very important. When we have anxiety-provoking thoughts, okay, naturally, it follows that we're going to be feeling anxious. And in some of these sessions, we're going to begin to look at different situations where you feel anxious. And then we'll begin to analyze or look at closely what kind of thoughts were happening in those situations. Okay. And I'll invite anybody at any time can enter some details of a recent situation, nothing too personal, but a recent straightforward situation where they felt some degree of anxiety. Okay. And then I will take you through that and I will ask questions and ask you to enter answers. And then I will also talk about stuff and give some answers as well. Okay. So we begin to analyze the anxiety. Okay. Let's look at an example then of how thinking plays an important part in how we feel. Imagine that you're in bed at night time and you're asleep and you hear a bang, a noise in another part of the house or the apartment where you live. Okay. Now, because you're in bed, you don't know what caused that bang. Okay. We don't have any evidence yet. We've heard the bang. We're still in bed. We don't have any evidence which tells us accurately what caused that bang. Okay. Now, oftentimes when something happens, we begin to jump to conclusions. Okay. And we could think, for example, maybe it's a burglar, maybe somebody's trying to break into the house, maybe it's a criminal, maybe it's somebody who's violent, something dreadful is probably going to happen. Okay. Now, remember, we're still in bed. We haven't gone to investigate yet. Okay. We don't know what caused that bang, but already we're trying to explain and make sense of that bang in the house that we've heard by coming up with possible theories. It's a burglar, etc. Now, it follows on from that interpretation that we're going to start feeling quite anxious if we think there's a burglar in the house or a criminal of some kind, or if we think that something dreadful will happen. We're going to start feeling anxious, worried, nervous, short of breath, shaky. Okay, typical symptoms of anxiety. And that's totally understandable. Okay. In CBT, what we're saying here is that when something happens, okay, in this case, there's a bang in the house. It's not the bang in the house that caused the way that we feel, the anxiety, the nervousness, the worry, etc. It's not the bang that has caused that. But what has caused that anxiety, that nervousness, that worry is the intervening interpretation of the bang. So the thoughts that came into our mind automatically, those thoughts have created the anxiety. Okay. If you have any questions about this, please do enter them into the chat box. Okay. Now, remember, we don't know what's happened yet, what's caused that bang. We have no evidence to go on, but our mind has jumped to a conclusion. Okay. And what we've done there by thinking it's a burglar, it's a criminal, somebody's breaking in, something bad's going to happen. What we've done really, in the absence of evidence, we've jumped to conclusions. Okay. And we've made pretty drastic conclusions. And the thinking error we have made there is we have catastrophized. Okay. We have assumed the worst case scenario. Okay. Imagine the same thing happens in somebody else's house in another part of town. Okay. They're in bed. They hear a bang in another part of the house or the apartment. And their interpretation, the thoughts that jump into their head, are quite different to person number one. Their interpretation is something like, it's probably my partner who's come home late. Maybe it's the cat. The cat has jumped on the window ledge and knocked over the vase of flowers, for example, the vase of flowers. Maybe it's the wind outside has blown away the patio furniture or something like this. Okay. Now, for that person in another part of town who interpreted that bang in the house in that kind of way, you can imagine that they would feel pretty okay. They might feel relaxed, they would feel okay, no impact. So, do you see that in that situation, it's not what happened? It's not the bang in the other part of the house that has created those feelings. It is that person's interpretation of that bang in the house that has created the feelings. Okay. This is central to CBT. Okay. And maybe make a note of this. It's not what happens that causes the distress, but rather it's our interpretation of what happens that causes the distress. Excuse me. It's the stuff that goes on up here that causes the feelings down here. Okay. Keep that in mind. Make a note of that, I would recommend. Okay. Let's continue with this one scenario. In a different part of town, a person is sleeping at night time, and 3 o'clock in the morning, there's a bang in some part of their house or their apartment. Okay. Their interpretation of that bang is again different. So the thought that jumps into their mind is, I bet that's my noisy neighbors again. Maybe they're having a party. They're so inconsiderate. Why do they do these things? Maybe my heating water boiler is breaking down and that caused a bang in the house. Okay. Now, those interpretations of the bang might help to create, for example, a bit of anger about the neighbors, a bit of stress about the possibility of the boiler breaking down, and that's going to cost a whole load of money to get it fixed. It might create annoyance, but it wouldn't necessarily create anxiety. Okay. So again, in this situation, you can see that it's not what happened that is causing the emotional response, but rather it's the interpretation of what happened that creates the anxiety. So make a note of this. What we think about, we bring about. Okay. What we think about, we bring about in terms of the way that we feel. Okay. We have so many thousands of thoughts that run through our mind each day. Okay. And it can be difficult to keep track of them. And we can sometimes feel that our thoughts are automatic and that we don't have any control over them. Okay. But in CBT, we say, no, that's not the case. Thoughts are automatic at times. Okay. But the way that we think about situations, the way that we respond in our mind to situations can be changed. Okay. Make a note of this. It's just a thought, and thoughts can be changed. Okay. With practice of these skills and strategies that we're going to cover in these workshops, with practice, you'll be able to begin to keep a record of how you think in various situations where you felt anxious. Then you'll be able to identify the thinking error. Okay. And then you'll be able to use skills to find more helpful, compassionate, realistic, supportive, and constructive alternatives to those thoughts. And the idea is that, as sure as night follows day, once we find these helpful, constructive, supportive, alternative ways of thinking, we're going to start feeling more relaxed, more okay, less anxious, less worried. Okay. So that's the nuts and bolts of CBT. How we think affects how we feel. Okay. It's important at this point to make the assertion that there are no right or wrong ways to think. Okay. Nobody has the monopoly on correct thinking. Okay. Not that I know of anyway. So there are no correct ways to think, no right and wrongs in this, but there are helpful and constructive ways of thinking. And at the opposite end of the spectrum, there are unhelpful ways of thinking that lead to psychological distress, such as anxiety. Okay. So with these skills, we get to begin putting them into practice, and before long, we will have automatic thoughts that are helpful and constructive rather than otherwise. Okay. I'm going to turn my little sheet here and move on. Okay. So here's a question for you, and you could email me your thoughts on this. Okay. What's the difference between CBT, as I've just described it, cognitive behavior therapy, and that main theory that I've just described? What's the difference between that and positive thinking? Okay. Have a think about that for a moment. You can enter your answer into the chat box, or you can email me separately. And whilst you think of that, I'll take a quick glass of drink of water over. Okay. Bob from New York has said that positive thinking is unrealistic. Okay. Another comment. Let me see. CBT is doesn't always need to be positive thinking. Bob, I think you make an important point there. Okay, that positive thinking, it can be helpful. Okay, if we choose to think more positively in situations, certainly we will feel better. Okay, but positive thinking per se, and the idea that we should think positive in every situation, and that the idea that every situation is positive if we choose to think that way, I think could be quite unrealistic in some scenarios. Okay, and it could be unhelpful because, let's face facts, difficult situations arise, challenges happen, problems occur that can be difficult to deal with. And if we just think positive about that, we put a positive spin on it, we might not be able to get to the bottom of that issue in a helpful and constructive way. But I would argue that in CBT, what we do is we explore ways of implementing helpful and constructive thinking, but crucially realistic ways of thinking. Okay, so our thinking ideally needs to be helpful, helping us to feel the way that we want to feel, helping us to achieve what we want to achieve, helping us to do what we want to do. Our thinking ideally will be compassionate towards other people, the way that we think about other people. Ideally, that would be compassionate. But crucially, and perhaps more importantly, our thinking needs to be compassionate towards ourselves. Okay. Some of the thinking errors that we will cover in future workshops, we'll begin to look at this more closely. But one of the thinking errors, for example, is giving ourselves a hard time, beating ourselves up, criticizing ourselves. Okay. If we make a mistake, an automatic thought might be, Oh, I'm so stupid. Why did I do that? I should know better, etc., etc., etc. We give ourselves a hard time. We criticize ourselves. Okay. And then, as sure as night follows day, that leads to sad feelings of sadness, anxiety, worry, lack of confidence. Okay. So that would be the thinking error of, criticizing ourselves, put downs, critical, negative put downs for ourselves. Okay. Not being compassionate. Okay. So I keep repeating this kind of mantra. Remember, it's not what happens, but how we interpret what happens, and that causes the distress. Second mantra, what we think about, we bring about. Okay. In terms of anxiety, anxious thoughts, as sure as night follows day, lead to anxiety, anxious feelings. So if we interpret a situation in an anxious kind of a way, and we come up with anxious thoughts, our feelings will reflect that, and we will feel anxious. Okay. So the idea is that we begin to explore our anxious thinking and then identify what thinking errors we're making. Okay. And then the third step is to identify more helpful, realistic, compassionate, and supportive ways of thinking in that kind of situation. Okay. Now, thinking helpful and constructive thoughts on a regular basis doesn't come naturally for many of us. It really doesn't. In society, when we're growing up, we're often influenced by teachers, parents, our siblings, our friends, family, the culture that we grow up in. We're influenced by society that we grow up in, the culture that we grow up in, our personal circumstances, poverty during childhood, all these different things, physical illness, trauma, for example. All these things play a part in influencing the way that we think about stuff. Okay. In CBT, the idea is that we don't have to go back to our childhood to explore that in any great length, to identify where did these thoughts come from and how did that happen and why did that happen. Okay. Sometimes in CBT therapy, we do go to explore events in the past for the client, but we don't stay there. We just go back in order to learn and help the client to fully understand what happened back then and how that is playing a part in the here and now. Okay. So what we're doing there is finding out where the negative thoughts came from, just briefly, and then we're back to the focus on the here and now. Okay, how can we make changes in the here and now? Okay. Anxious thoughts tend to focus on some kind of threat. Okay. We, for some reason, sense danger around us, and we have anxious thoughts. Like, for example, that bang downstairs, it's obviously some kind of danger. Okay. Oftentimes we can misinterpret what happens, and we can see danger where no danger exists. Okay. Now, in the past, this served us well. So, for example, when we were nomads moving around in the distant past, there were lots of dangers around. And if we were walking through a forest, for example, several thousand years ago, and we heard a rustling in the leaves, we would feel anxious because there could well be a dangerous animal in those bushes or a dangerous person, for example. So it made great sense for us to identify that straight away as some kind of a threat and to take action, maybe to run away in the opposite direction or get ready to defend ourselves. Okay. That automatic interpretation of this situation back then made perfect sense, and it helped us to survive as a species. But in the here and now, it's not always helpful for us to automatically think that this situation is directly threatening to us. Okay. Some situations obviously can be threatening, and it would be entirely appropriate for us to feel anxious and to take appropriate action in those circumstances. But on the whole, most of us hopefully are pretty safe. And when these situations occur where there's a bang downstairs, for example, most often it's something entirely innocent. The cat has knocked over the vase. It's a windy, stormy night outside. Your partner's home late and he has closed a cupboard and it's made a bang, a bit of a noise. Okay. So what we're doing, we're beginning to retrain our responses to situations so that they're more appropriate, they're more helpful, they're more constructive, they're more realistic. Okay. And it can be a bit of a vicious circle because when we feel anxious, okay, so a situation has happened, excuse me, we've interpreted it in an anxious kind of way. We feel anxious as a result. And whilst we're anxious, we can then interpret other situations in a more anxious way as well, inappropriately, without the evidence. And so sometimes it can be a bit of a vicious loop. Okay. And it can be difficult to identify the exact cause or the beginning of this anxiety. But from CBT perspective, it doesn't matter. What does matter is that we begin to focus on how we can intervene in this cycle of anxiety. And very often that intervention begins at the cognitive level, how we're thinking on a daily basis. Okay. Have a think about, between now and the next session that we have a think about any example where you have felt anxious recently. Okay. And get yourself a piece of paper. Okay. And draw a little table. If you email me, I can send out some of these CBT sheets. Okay. Happy to do that. This one is called an ABC sheet, and it's a typical sheet that we begin using in CBT with clients. Okay. So back to the task. Think about a recent situation where you have felt anxious. Okay. Excuse me. And draw a table with 3 columns. Okay. In the left-hand column is the A column. Give it a title, A. And next to that, write what happened. So the A column is what happened. Okay. In the middle column, give that title B. Okay. B for beliefs. And the title in that is thoughts and beliefs about what happened. Okay. And in the third column, give that the title C for consequences. C for consequences, colon, how we felt. Okay, how we felt, which is where we describe our emotions. Okay. Now, if you think of the example I gave earlier, where somebody's in bed at night time, they hear a bang. What happened? X was in bed at night time. I heard a bang at 3 o'clock in the morning. Okay. That's in the A column, what happened. In the B column, thoughts and beliefs, in the example that we discussed, would be, it's a burglar, it's a criminal, something dreadful is going to happen. That would be in the B column because those are the thoughts and beliefs that went through the person's mind. Okay. And in the C column, the consequences, the emotional consequences, we would there, in that column, we would write anxiety, worry, nervousness, etc. Okay. So once you've drawn this table, we call it the ABC sheet. Okay. All CBT therapists begin using this in the early days of therapy. Okay. What I'd like you to do, what would be really helpful, is to enter a recent example where you felt anxious. Don't share any private or personal details, and try and keep it quite straightforward as well. In the early days, keep it simple and straightforward. Okay. In the B column, try and describe how you thought. What thoughts did you have after this thing that happened, during or after this thing that happened that you're writing about? Okay. And in the C column, describe your feelings during or after this thing that happened. Okay. And if you want to email that to me, if you want to, I could use it anonymously in the following session where I'll begin to look at that. And I won't identify any names or personal circumstances, but I'll just literally go through what you have written, what you have entered in those boxes, and I'll begin to break it down. I'll use it as an example. Excuse me, a glass of water is called for. A brief thought came into my mind then. If I stop for a drink of water, what will people think of me? What will the people watching this live stream, what will they think of me? How will they interpret that? Will they think that I'm unprofessional and why is he keeping us waiting, etc.? That's an example of automatic thoughts. And if I allowed those thoughts to take hold, I'd perhaps feel some negative emotions. I'd feel worried. I would feel self-conscious, and behavior-wise, I would probably refrain from drinking any more water. Okay. But in my mind, when those automatic thoughts come in, I quickly turn them around and I quickly say to myself, okay, drinking water during a presentation is entirely appropriate. As we're speaking for 40 minutes or so, our mouth begins to dry out, and everybody needs water, and that's okay. And I'd also remind myself that I don't know what anybody else is thinking. I can't think in their minds. Okay. I only know what I'm thinking and what I'm feeling. Okay. So with the skills that you learn on this course, you'll be able to begin to turn around in shorter and shorter spaces of time. You'll be able to turn around those situations where you feel anxious. You'll turn around the thoughts. You'll make changes to your behavioral responses. And you'll begin to notice the anxiety levels that you experience begin to come down quite significantly over time. And the duration of the anxiety, so how long the anxiety lasts for, will also begin to come down. The more that you learn these skills and you implement them and you practice them on a frequent basis. Okay. CBT skills, they're not rocket science. Anybody can learn them. Anybody can implement them. You don't need any prior experience. You don't have to be in CBT therapy, but if it helps, do search out a CBT therapist. So they're not rocket science. Anybody can learn them. And they're like any other skills. If you learn a language, for example, okay, it takes a bit of time and it takes practice and perseverance. Okay. And when you're learning a language, one of the things your language teacher might advise you to do is to write down some of the sentences in the new language. Okay. And put them on little post-it notes. Put them around the house to remind you of what the sentence is for I'm going to make a cup of tea, or I'm going to open the cupboard. Okay. Similar in CBT as well. Once we begin to learn the more helpful, constructive ways of thinking, we need to make some notes and remind ourselves, okay, it's okay to make mistakes. It's okay to drink water during a presentation. Okay. And we begin to think in more helpful, constructive ways. Okay. We're coming to the end of this first session. I hope you found it useful. Thank you to all of you that attended. I really appreciate that. Thank you for all the comments as well that you've put in the chat box. Several people have sent me their email addresses and have asked private questions, and I will answer you directly to your email address. And look forward to seeing you again, same time next week. That will be Sunday, the 24th of April at 7 p.m. UK time. Okay, 7 p.m. London time. Hope you found this useful. I really look forward to working with you in the future weeks. Please click to like any and all of my videos, especially this one. Please subscribe to the channel and opt in for reminders and updates about when the next session is going to be. Okay. Really appreciate any helpful, constructive feedback and comments that you can leave on the channel. Really do appreciate that. Okay. Thank you very much for your time. Have a great week. And remember, it's not what happens, but it's how we interpret what happens. That is the key to how we feel. Okay. Make a note and stick it on your refrigerator. What I think about, I bring about. Okay. Have a wonderful week. Thank you very much. Speak again soon. Good night from London, England.